laws have rules. This war was genocidal because of the bombing of hospitals, refugee camps, and marketplaces. In one of the worst bombings in a place called Otuocha and Aguleri, I think it's in modern-day Anambra State, in one single day, about approximately 500 civilians were slaughtered. The war was also genocidal because of the rape of girls and women, the starvation of civilian populations, the murder of hundreds of unarmed boys and men in Asaba, economic blockades, and also importantly, post-war economic victimizations and the seizure of property and businesses. The war would go on to claim an additional, estimates put this at up to 3 million lives. There are some important factors to take into account when we think about genocides. Genocides are predominantly the result of animosity and prejudice against an ethnic, religious, racial, or other group based on unfounded fears and perceived threats. In this regard, I would like to refer to the mention here is usually unfounded. And these are things that many of us here, if not all of us here in this room, can relate to. Also important is the fact that acts of genocide are almost always instigated by a political or religious leader. It's hardly the people themselves. Usually people live in harmony until acts of genocide are provoked by respected religious or political leaders. Another important aspect of genocide, and I'll put all of this together, is the fact that you must justify killing people. You have to justify your hatred for them. So you have to make up stories, and they're usually slanted and biased. They are greedy. They are thieves. They are liars. They are rapists. They like money too much. I've heard that once. As if there's any group of Nigerians who don't like money. Also important is the fact that the methods of elimination are brutal and vicious. They involve everything from massacre to torture, mutilation, poisoning, the use of disease, deportation, confinement, starvation, deprivation of political influence. Your political powers are taken from you, or your economic powers. You impose economic stagnation on a group of people. You take away from them their means of livelihood, or you occupy their lands and take over their lands. Now, like I said yesterday, occupation doesn't have to be physical. People can stay hundreds of miles away and exploit your oil or other resources. They don't have to be on your land. Now, to fully understand the use of genocide or mass murder as a weapon to get what people want in Nigeria, we need to look at history. And the aspect of history that I'd like to look at is the history of Islam in Nigeria. Now, when I talk about Islam, I'm not generalizing. I'm not saying anything bad about the faith. However, the manner in which a religion is introduced to a group of people determines the way it is perceived, the way it is utilized, and perhaps the way it is exploited.
Can you connect to radio Biafra?
I'm also going to talk about the Fulani who spread Islam, or who introduced Islam. Primarily, they primarily introduced Islam to northern Nigeria. I'll talk about that again without generalizing, I'm not talking about every single Fulani person out there. When we talk about racism in America, it's largely
He's on the highest.
been executed, if you like, by people of European descent. But even when you talk about it, you can't generalize. Not all white people or people of European descent. However, back to Islam and the way it spread. In a place like Ghana, it spread largely through trade, through Hausa-speaking traders and the Mande people and other people. However, in Nigeria, it spread violently through the Fulani, and this is extremely significant. You would, if you reflect or think about it, there's hardly been any instance of violence or mass killings in Ghana involving Muslims, or you hardly hear of clashes between Muslims and other religious groups. It has a lot to do with how the faith was introduced. It was largely peaceful means. However, like I said, it spread in Nigeria, through northern Nigeria, largely through violence. Now, history tells us, and the dates may differ from person to person, that it was from around the 5th century that the Fulani would begin to migrate from areas around Morocco and Mauritania to settle in parts of Senegal in a place called Futatoro, and eventually they spread out. Now, from the 11th century, when Islam began to gain a stronghold in West Africa, the Fulani would embrace this faith. And as they embrace Islam, it would transform their interaction with people who they begin to see as infidels that they have a right to conquer, dominate, and convert. And so they begin to conquer territories from around the 17th century, around Senegal and Guinea. And then eventually they would begin to move eastward from maybe around the 16th century and would settle in what we understand to be the Hausa Kingdom in present-day Nigeria. And between 1804 and 1808, Usman Dan Fodio would carry out a jihad in Hausa land. He was successful. He conquered the entire region except the Borno Empire, and he set up the Sokoto Caliphate, the original name being the Fula Sokoto Caliphate. The larger Hausa population came under Fulani control, and many were enslaved. Attempts by the Fulani to conquer territories southward was resisted by powerful territories like the Benin Kingdom and the Oyo Empire, even though they did make incursions eventually into the Oyo Empire, or at least parts of the Oyo Empire. And today you have a significant number of Muslims in southwest Nigeria. It was difficult for them to move south, partly because of the Middle Belt. The Middle Belt, because of its mountainous terrain, was a problem for the Fulani who fought on horseback. These were one of the first groups of West Africans to fight on horseback. So that slowed them down. However, by the 17th century, they were politically dominant in many parts of Africa. That includes a section of the great empire of Mali that they conquered and created what would eventually become the Massina Empire. They also conquered Timbuktu. And eventually, they would split up into emirates. Their empire would split up into emirates across the region. And today, they occupy several West and Central African countries, including the Sudan and even coastal areas around the Red Sea. They would also be slowed down by colonialism and by their defeat in places like Nigeria by the British. But here are important things to understand about this history. First of all, we understand from this history that the Fulani were very skilled fighters who fought on horseback. As they conquered and settled in new areas, they were introduced to new forms of wealth and political power, which they embraced. They adopted a philosophy, and it is safe to say that some of them may still uphold this philosophy, again without generalizing. And what is this philosophy? That they have the right to settle anywhere that offers them the economic and political and agricultural power that they crave. If land is not given to them freely, they have the right to take it violently, especially if it is occupied by infidels. This is all historical. I'm not making any of this up. Also, it is a fallacy to believe that they're just looking for grazing land. When they conquered the Hausa kingdom, did they just graze? No. They ruled, they took over economic power, political power, and they enslaved them. So we need to move past that notion that we have, that this is all about grazing. Now, just like the Fulani, the Arabs who introduced Islam to them were also predominantly desert nomads. Now, Islam united the Arabs, and as they spread the religion, they conquered and established political control in areas far beyond their lands. They became aware of the immense political, economic, and agricultural opportunities involved in creating new empires. Now, let's pause and we'll now apply that history to some of the things that are happening today. With the coming of independence, new regional and ethnic rivalries and conflicts began to emerge. Now, prior to this time, it wasn't uncommon all across West Africa for people to have what I may refer to as stranger settlements. People were welcome as strangers to various lands, and they were given a place to stay. They were even allowed to have their own leaders as long as they honored the original owners of the land. So when we hear of Sabongari, for instance, in northern Nigeria, this is pre-colonial. This isn't something that just came up with colonialism. It always existed, and we have such settlements in places like the Ghanaian Empire, Mali, and so on and so forth. However, like I said, things will begin to change, and new ethnic rivalries and conflicts will begin to emerge as a result of colonialism. And the Fulani saw a threat and competition that they had to subdue, and that threat was the Igbo people. And I'm going to explain. Now, First of all, the Fulani had established a tradition of moving in large numbers and occupying new territories. So when they saw a group of people that seemed to be doing the same thing, those people became a threat. Now, why would the Igbos become a threat? You had many other people in settler communities in the north. But the Igbos stood out for a number of reasons. First of all, they were the largest in number. Secondly, they engaged in extensive commercial activity. They were very aggressive in their industrious pursuits, so to speak. And so, gradually, they were no longer seen as welcome settlers, but as competitors for the new economic and political powers introduced by colonialism. There are other reasons why the Igbos began to emerge as a threat. If you look at history, the first army officer was an Igbo man, Lieutenant Victor Woman. When graduates started to join the Nigerian army, the second, after Olutoye, was an Igbo man, who would eventually become General Ojukwu and the head of Biafra. First president, Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe, the first mathematician to receive international attention, Chikobi, who actually failed his, I think it was the equivalent of GC. He failed math, but went back. That was his motivation. The first woman to publish in the English language out of Africa, Oranwapa. Now, Professor Soyinka won the Nobel Prize, as did Albert Camus from Algeria. Chinua Achebe didn't, but Chinua Achebe is the best-known writer coming out of the African continent. Chinua Achebe's novel, Things Fall Apart, is also the most widely read novel coming out of the African continent. There are other areas that the Igbos also began to establish themselves. And if you think about the history that I mentioned, it's either you appreciate them and interconnect with them, or you see them as a threat. Even in areas like sports, music, academics, you have a lot of people from different parts of Nigeria who excel. If you take the Igbos out, there'll be a gaping hole there, and I'm not saying it to brown-nose anybody, I'm saying it because it's the truth. Most importantly, the Igbo people occupied a region with a resource that was gaining global attention, and that's crude oil. And so, the first coup and Decree 34, and we can talk about this later on, have been used as reasons for genocide against Easterners, mainly Igbos, beginning in 1966. However, long before the coup, the Premier of the North, and is it ironic that he was Fulani, Sir Ahmadu Bello, in an interview expresses his absolute disdain for the Igbos. Now, I've listened to that interview, and honestly, I would sympathize with him if he said, you know what, since Igbo people came here, they've been burning down our mosques. Armed robbery has gone up. They've been raping our girls. But he doesn't say that. He actually says great things about the Igbo people. He says they want to aspire to be the best. Okay. So this is something we all aspire for, all things being equal. Except there's something wrong with you. You want to be the best. And that's what we teach our children if you're raising any children. To be the best. Now let's remember that the Sultana of Sokoto was the equivalent of a crown prince, and when he spoke, he became the voice of his people. When he spoke, people listened to him because he was very powerful religiously and politically. Though this interview has been captured on YouTube, that's the one we see. What are the chances that that's the only time that he declared his hatred for Igbo people? He was probably on a campaign. And what are the chances that he was the only one? Now let's remember that Ahmadu Bello was also the one who said, and I quote, "We, the people of the North, will continue our stated intention to conquer the South and to dip the Quran in the Atlantic Ocean after the British leave our shores." And we now make the connection. You see the connection I'm making between his people feeling threatened and the history of using violence and mass murder to get what people want. Essentially, the process for genocide was already taking place long before 1966. All they needed were reasons to implement it. And the reasons came with the first coup and Decree 34. Now let's think about Decree 34. If you ask those howling mobs who were running around and destroying people's lives and homes,